Welcome back to the workshop, guys, and we're getting into making some freaking armor finally. This is the very first piece in the harness that we're going to be designing, an infantry harness, an Italian export in the Flemish style. The first harness, guys, I've ever got to make for myself. We have a mission and a goal, which is getting this done for Call to Arms 2023. And this is going to be the first part of that build, a set of gauntlets inspired from history. Grab your hammers, let's get stuck into it. Okay, so we have some of the materials laid out here that we're going to be using in our build. Got a few bolts and nuts here for bolting things together, various rivets of different types, some hammers, and this rusty sheet of 1.2mm steel. I know it doesn't look like much, but we will be cleaning that back before we can trace anything onto the steel. Speaking of tracing things onto the steel, we need a pattern. Now, I've made a few of these gauntlets at Red Heart Reproductions, my day job as an armorer, but Iron Crown Workshop, we don't have a freaking gauntlet pattern. So we're gonna have to make our own direct from the historical originals. And you know what that means? We need some originals to base it on. I love my originals. So what we're gonna do is collect a bunch of gauntlets from museums that are around the correct context of our build for your boy to design, draw, come up with a pattern that's gonna be authentic and meet our goals of authenticity here at Iron Crown Workshop. So that's gonna be our goal for today, collecting those resources and getting a bit of a portfolio together to send off to Officeworks, get it printed, and then display on our boards behind me right here. Using historical originals like this is consistent with our mentality of approaching this build and this entire series from a perspective of historical accuracy and authenticity. All of this process of research that can seem quite tedious, it's important to remember that the devil is in the detail. If we're gonna go to all this effort to design a pattern, look at originals, build this freaking gauntlet, then we might as well use the same mentality when it comes to the details. A good example of how detail informs a more comprehensive and rich approach to an art form or a project is The Lord of the Rings. Probably my favorite fantasy series ever produced, and probably the most convincing adaptation of fantasy or medieval on the silver screen. A lot of the reason behind that is the team, the Weta Workshop that designed the pieces for that film set, went to the detail, went to the effort of delving into the lore, into the culture, finding real cultural inspirations behind the characters, behind the pieces that they were making for that film. And all of that translates to an immersive, engaging, and meaningful experience for the audience. So here with our projects, we want to go to that same level of detail and imbue our gauntlet and our whole project with a sense of history, story, and meaning, as well as accuracy from a functional perspective. Now in our last episode, we actually established a context around our entire harness, and that's gonna affect the choices for this gauntlet too. We established a context with three main components: date, region, and cohesion. The date we selected was informed by our modern context of Call to Arms, the date being 1460 to 1470, about a decade before the Burgundian Wars. That's our time frame. The second element of that is region. We chose Italian export armor in the Flemish style. That's gonna influence the choices big time. And third, but not least, is cohesion. How does this piece work with the rest of the pieces in our harness? And how does it work within the context of the history as well? Because we wanna make sure it works with our beautiful sallet from the Royal Armories. Ooh, I like that sallet. And we want to make sure that it works with the world. Where does this fit in context with Milan? The armor is working in Milan, the marks, all of that juicy detail that we love here at Iron Crown Workshop. But without further ado, let's get the laptop out and let's start looking for some of these pieces and get a bit of a database together for us to start learning some lessons, doing some crafting. Well, you're coming along with us for this armoring journey. How you can help us out is by supporting us here on Patreon. And that is the journey of Iron Crown Workshop as we work to building our team and these projects and putting together a really fantastic channel that we want you guys to be a part of. Jump on there and support us, be part of our team. Let's get back to some armoring. Gauntlets. while we've set a date around the 1460 to 1470 mark for the pieces we're looking for, it's interesting to actually look at the evolution of gauntlets, Italian gauntlets in this case, throughout the 15th century. There's a couple of different generational changes that end up happening, and one particular evidence of change in gauntlets that we're going to be looking at in terms of choosing our piece is how the cuff changes shape. Earlier on in the 15th century, we have a much more rounded cuff shape, more like a bell shape, and that slowly evolves into a more and more pointed cuff around 1450 to 1460, and by the time of around 1470 to the end of the 15th century, Italian gauntlets tend to have quite an elongated leaf shape cuff that's indicative of that later style. They often inherit a central crease as well, which also dates the pieces as being later. It's kind of cool to be able to actually look at and see how gauntlets evolved from the early 14th century hourglass gauntlets right the way to the 16th century complex pieces of armor that we see later on. I'm being seduced by the armor, it's sucking me into the process. So what are those marks? I'm pretty sure this is the Avant gauntlet, and those look like the Missaglia family marks. We have the MY and the two crosses with an M under it. That's around 1440 to 1450, and then over here we have this gauntlet, which is another right hand, also a Missaglia gauntlet, but with the pointed cuff. So potentially, the earlier one was made by the father, this one here by the son. So that's really cool. I'm gonna guess that these rivets here are originals, since they look like they're peened more on the outside, and then these larger, more refined domed head rivets are probably modern or a later addition when the gauntlet was reassembled. I don't know that for certain, I'm sure there's experts that do, but that'd be my guess. So much to learn. There's so many pieces of armor to memorize and know all the nuances about and document. That's why it's a lifelong pursuit, guys. Hopefully not too long. So far, we have a lot of the basics of our gauntlet roughed out. We have the basic year, which is 1460 to 70, which means that the cuff of our gauntlet is going to have that leaf shape. It's going to have that pointed cuff, probably that central crease that we've been seeing. And the construction of our gauntlet and how it functions, we're getting from the Italians as well. That clamshell shape, those multiple hand pieces, as opposed to the German style. But what we're missing is what's going to make our build Flemish? What's going to make our build an Italian export piece? What little clues can we find that would make it correct for that region? Well, looking at the Flemish style, we often see just plain Italian gauntlets, but also the Flemish style relies a little bit more heavily on fluting elements and a little bit more artistic shaping going on. And when we look at some of the gauntlets that we have, we do see examples of Italian-made gauntlets around the same date that do have a little bit of fluting in them. That kind of lends itself to being styled towards that Western European market that we were talking about. Potentially export pieces, potentially in the Flemish style. It's hard to say for certain with any of these things. However, it's a possibility we need to consider. Actually, we couldn't have a better example in that we have the reliquary of Charles the Bold himself, and it has his armor, and what do you know, one of those things is a gauntlet, and by all intents and purposes, it looks exactly like an Italian gauntlet. It has that leaf-shaped cuff we're talking about, has those hand protections, and it has that central crease. So if it's good enough for Charles the Bold, it's probably good enough for us as well. All right, I'm pretty happy with the selection of original sources that we have to work with here. It's pretty interesting to note that the sources come from a lot of different angles, different types of sources. Of course, as you may expect, there's quite a few pieces that are from museums, like the Metropolitan Museum of Art. They're fantastic as a resource on armor, love it. Also, we have artworks contemporary to the time period, painted at the time of the armors that we're looking at, even manuscript illustrations, And what's even crazier, we have a reliquary of Charles the Bold. So we have a range of different sources that are all helping us get a better idea of what we want to actually be building. We're going to send it off to get printed, and then we can get about choosing which build we're going to be doing. That wraps up the research phase of our process. We've chosen a range of original sources based upon the date and the region we selected for our entire harness. The next step is to choose which of those are going to be the basis for our gauntlet, and then develop a pattern based upon those that will enable us to make it in steel. If you've enjoyed following the process with us so far, please consider supporting us on Patreon, where you get to see behind the scenes of our process, and at the end of our project, even get access to the patterns for these gauntlets that we're making right here and right now. See you guys in the next episode.